Welcome to Lawyerpreneur, where we discuss the alternate paths that allow lawyers to engage their entrepreneurial spirits, connect their creativity to their careers, and distinguish themselves from others. I'm your host, Jeremy Richter. This episode is brought to you by ALPS, Legal Malpractice Insurance Made Easy. As the largest direct writer of lawyers' malpractice insurance, ALPS provides outstanding insurance products, claims handling by licensed attorneys with private practice backgrounds, and risk management resources to help your firm be successful. ALPS understands that being a lawyer is hard, and they want to help make it a bit easier. Their online application takes as little as 20 minutes to complete, so you can get back to what really matters. To find out more, visit alpsinsurance.com. Now, on to the interview. My guest today is Kevin Gold, an employment and IP lawyer at Pillar Ott in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. I first learned about Kevin on the Freakonomics podcast, episode 493, if you want to go check it out, in which he was interviewed as a part of his specialized practice of representing long snappers in the NFL. Kevin, welcome to Lawyerpreneur.
Oh, thanks for having me, Jeremy. I appreciate it.
All right, let's start with making sure everybody knows what we're talking about, because while I live in Alabama and everyone here is born with like an instinctual knowledge of football, there are other places in the country where folks might not know who the long snapper is and what he does.
Yeah, I always like to define terms, and as lawyers, we're trained to do that. So a long snapper is a specialized position in football. They generally play 8 to 10 to 12 plays a game, and they have one goal. Their goal is to come in on fourth down, and they're either snapping to one or two kickers. They're either snapping the ball to a punter, generally at 15 yards, on fourth down when they can't get a first down. So snapper comes in, snaps the ball to the punter punts it downfield, hopefully very high and far, and the snapper sometimes blocks a man and then runs downfield to try and make a tackle. The other, probably more critical role of a snapper is he is the person who snaps the ball to the holder on field goals and extra points. So combined, when you look at punts and extra points and field goals, that's a position player that's maybe 8, 10, 12 plays a game. But unlike the quarterback who can complete 70% of his passes and be a hero, unlike a wide receiver who can catch 8 out of 10 passes and they're one of the best in the NFL, the margin for error, the accuracy, the precision that's required of a long snapper is you have to be 100% accurate. Because if you're not, you're out of a job. And if anybody knows your name, that's usually not a good thing, unless they're doing a podcast about you.
And so those 8 to 12 plays a game, anybody that's watched football knows that special teams plays can make or break a game. And so they can be hugely pivotal.
Absolutely. They are. And one of the most people who hear what I do, that I specialize in representing NFL long snappers, they're surprised that the NFL rosters are filled with somebody who does just this role, because rosters are precious. The NFL traditionally has 53 or 55 players on a roster. Only about 46 are active on a game day. But because the margin of error in games is so close, because games were decided by a point or two here and there, about 15 years ago, the NFL decided, you know what, I'm not going to take a chance on using some other position player to do this job. It is so important. It is so vital that our kicks be precise, that the ball be held the proper way, that I'm going to dedicate a roster spot to it. And what I've seen from the NFL beginning to specialize in it, where they have just one guy who that's all they do, what I've seen is that it's now trickled down to college. So Alabama is one of the schools, for example, that'll often give a 4-year scholarship to a snapper. That person is going to come on campus in Tuscaloosa in March or maybe June or July. That's going to be their only role. That's all they're going to do. And then now I'm also in turn seeing it trickle down to high school, where, again, a position player may still play a little bit of tight end or play a little bit of offensive line, but their real goal, their real specialty is that long snapping. So I think as games have become closer, more competitive, it just gives teams a competitive edge to have the best person making that snap 8, 10, 12 plays a game.
All right. So tell me the origin story of you wanting to be an NFL agent.
Yeah, so I am, 5'6". I love sports, but it became clear after high school I wasn't going to continue playing any kind of sports. But I love sports, and so going through college, I was trying to figure out, okay, I love sports, but everybody loves sports. How do I make a difference to kind of make an impact and stay involved? And, this was back in the mid 80s. So there wasn't the internet. There wasn't all these sources about what agents do and what sports agents are. So the best advice that I had gotten, I was working as a paralegal at a law firm. This was after college, but before law school. And I heard a sports agent on the radio in New York City who said, hey, the best advice is to go to law school. So I went to law school really not for the purpose of being in court, not for the purpose of helping, employers with employee issues or protecting trademarks, but really to kind of give me a strong foothold to get in the sports industry. So I went to law school in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, which is a hotbed for football. When I got out of law school, I started getting traditional legal jobs, but on the side, I was trying to develop a practice as an NFL agent. So I thought that football was probably the best sport because they have more players on a roster, and it was a sport that I had a chance to maybe develop some connections because I was in Pennsylvania. So that's kind of how it started.
I saw on your Twitter feed, I saw it today, you posted the other day about your first client, Rob Davis. So how did you go from, I want to do this, to landing that first NFL client?
Yeah, that's the hardest thing as an agent, right? Because anybody you talk to wants to know, well, who else do you represent? And to me, the hardest thing is getting that first one. So I mentioned I'm in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Harrisburg has a small Division II program called Shippensburg University. That's about a half hour from Harrisburg. And they have a very good Division II football program, but it's very rare that a player goes from Shippensburg to the NFL. They usually go from Shippensburg to selling insurance. But as I was getting out of law school and as I was in Pennsylvania practicing as a lawyer, sure enough, Shippensburg had this one player that was very talented defensive lineman, but also had this other skill that he could long snap. And a football player I know says, hey, you want to talk to Rob Davis? He's a great long snapper. He was a great defensive end, but I think he has NFL talent as a long snapper. And again, even though I knew sports, I didn't know that NFL teams were starting to keep one position spot for a long snapper. So I got connected to Rob. It's a famous story between us because our first meeting was at a food court at a Harrisburg Mall. So I'm literally sitting with him in the food court. He was working at the prison next door to the food court, and I caught him on lunch break. So we had a lunch break. And I basically said, look, I can devote all my time and attention and effort and energy to you. Parentheses, because I have nobody else to devote my time, effort, and energy to. But that didn't matter. He didn't care. He had already been in an NFL training camp, didn't really have a good relationship with his agent, so said, I will give you a chance. You seem young and hungry. I was literally hungry. We were in the food court. You seem young and hungry. I'm going to give you a chance. And sure enough, from that meeting in the food court, I got Rob a job first in the Canadian Football League, which many people don't know this. They actually played one season in America. So he played in the CFL in Baltimore. And from playing that season in Canada, he then went to the Chicago Bears. But more notably, after one season in Chicago, he spent about 12, 13 years with the Green Bay Packers. So that was my first client to make it. Just happened to be a long snapper. I can't say there was any divine plan that, hey, I want to specialize in these guys. But I was Jerry Maguire for a couple of years. I had one client, and it just happened to be a long snapper. And timing wise, it's important. This was like the late 90s, early 2000s. And one day, Rob, I give him credit. One day he said to me, he goes, working with me, you're learning more about long snappers than anybody else. And what were people doing in the early 2000s? They were building websites because the internet was brand new. So I was able to secure longsnap.com. And on Rob's advice and with his help, we decided to kind of give this a forum, for lack of a better word, for people who love long snappers. Again, NFL teams were just starting to specialize. It was just starting to trickle down to colleges. So I created this website, longsnap.com, where I gave these people who normally their goal is to get no attention. We decided to give them a forum, and there would be snapping tips and snapping information. And from there, it kind of built my practice where I started to specialize in other NFL long snappers.
Well, and that's definitely one of the things I wanted to ask you about was the website and how that was instrumental in developing your player representation practice.
Honestly, I think it was because it gives you a sense of legitimacy, right? I mean, I got past the initial stage of having no clients because Rob was desperate and local and he gave me a shot. Once you have one, well, then you can kind of piggyback the one. So what I started to do is I was reach out to other NFL long snappers. And even though I wasn't representing them, I said, hey, would you be willing to answer questions from readers about how to hold the ball in a snap or give different advice? And from there, I started to build a network. So from Rob, my second client was Justin Snow, who played for the Indianapolis Colts for many years, won a Super Bowl ring. And from there, I kind of became known because I would pay attention to pro long snappers and college long snappers, and believe it or not, even high school long snappers. I kind of developed this reputation for this specialty. And from there, it kind of propelled itself. So yeah, that website was instrumental. And then kind of my practice is kind of followed technology. From the website, it then became a blog. And then I set up a Twitter account, longsnap.com with no dot. And so I've kind of developed this expertise. And therefore, anytime there was a major snapping issue, there was a big problem, a snapper got hurt, somebody got injured, somebody doesn't understand why the center just can't be the snapper, the media would tend to call me for quotes, and that kind of built my legitimacy. And so when I was meeting with college athletes, meeting with college long snappers, I was kind of known as the person. And honestly, a lot of the guys that I meet in college who I represent on the way to the NFL say, hey, I looked at your blog when I was going to college because you list every Division I college long snapper. And that helped me on my path to college. So kind of developed my legitimacy, my expertise, for lack of a better word.
Yeah. And I like the way you described how you kind of marketed yourself and built those relationships, in that you didn't necessarily, when you made contact with the long snappers, it wasn't, let me do business with you immediately. It was, hey, let's do this thing from the website and provide information. And I assume, in the same way that you market your law practice, that helps you build relationships. People get to know you, decide whether they like you, can trust you, and then maybe they do business with you down the road.
Yeah, business is really the secondary point. And it seems weird to say that, but that was truly it. I was more concerned with the craft, for lack of a better word, and the brotherhood that all snappers are. And they all kind of work together, and they're all friends. So, a lot of people ask me, how many do you represent? Or don't you represent all of them? No, I don't represent all of them. I know most of them. But I love I actually love, it's interesting that I kind of focused on this field because I'm kind of perfectionist in my personal life. I never made the analogy that I'm a perfectionist and I'm working with people who are true perfectionists, because I've had situations where my snappers have been involved in a last second game winning kick. And everybody is happy. Everyone's cheering. You talk to the player a half hour after the game, they're upset because that snap was just a half an inch off. So it's incredible, the people who do this unique role and what a perfectionist they really are. And I think this was mentioned by one of the NFL long snappers on the Freakonomics podcast. You have to fall in love with the monotony of looking for that kind of elusive, perfect snap. And these guys are just such great technicians. And people can make fun of it and say, oh, that's all you do. And, oh, you don't do anything during practice. You're just standing off there with the punter and the kicker. But, if the chips are down and that long snapper gets hurt, believe me, nobody else wants to do that job. So, yeah, I really fell in love with the people who do it because they all really have interesting stories of how they got to be a long snapper. It might be different now, where there might be a kid in high school now who says, yeah, I want to be a pro long snapper. I love it. But most of them started off as traditional football players, and for some reason they were injured or they weren't big enough or strong enough to play another position. And the niche of long snapping kind of found them, similar to my story.
That's really interesting. And I hadn't thought about it in this way, but in the same way that, when there's that game-winning kick, the kicker gets the hugs and, lifted up on shoulders. I don't know if there's anybody congratulating the long snapper because there's no camera on that. Yeah. But in the same way, like when I go to trial and have a successful outcome, like I'm get back to the office and I'm going to get all the accolades. But if the paralegal, if my assistant hadn't done all that work in the background to make sure that we were in a position to be successful, like I've got to make sure to give them the credit where it belongs to.
Absolutely. And these guys truly are the unsung heroes of football. And where you're going to hear it, you're not going to hear Troy Aikman or Joe Buck say, hey, that was a great snap. Once in a while it'll happen, especially if it's under adverse conditions. So if it's windy, it's snowy, it's rainy, the ball's wet, and they get off a good snap. Sometimes they'll mention the long snapper. Sometimes they'll show their name up there. But what's interesting to me is the kickers and the punters, they will always credit their long snappers because as Chris Rubio, who helped created the Patrick Manley Award for college long snappers with me, as he always remarks, the ball doesn't just appear to the holder. It doesn't just appear to the punter. It comes from somewhere. And the play literally starts with the long snapper. So again, most of them like the unsung life. I always tell my clients, the only time I want to hear about you in the newspaper or read about you is somebody doing a profile of you in July and August, when they just think, hey, you play a really unique role. That's the only time we want to hear your name. I don't want to hear Joe Buck talking about you. I don't want to hear Troy Aikman talking about, again, unless it's something unique off the field. And there's a lot of crazy stories. The former Eagles long snapper happens to also be a professional magician. All right, so that's an interesting story. Those kind of backstories we can hear about the long snapper. But on most Sundays at 1 and 4 o'clock Eastern time, I do not want to hear my client's name at all. And if I don't, they're generally doing a good job.
All right. So as a lifelong sports fan, what was it like going into those first negotiations for a contract with first the CFL and then the NFL?
Yeah, it's funny because I think people even now probably have this perception that, these negotiations are done in person and there's people smoking cigars and those type of things. Truth of the matter is back then it was just a couple of quick phone calls. And that's how a deal gets done. Now, actually, it's Excel spreadsheets and text messages. So I had a player in the draft last year who he didn't get drafted, but he signed after the draft. And that deal was done via text message. The contract negotiator texted me and said, how much for your guy? And I gave a number and then we went back and forth. And that's how it's done. So I think technology has really changed the way those negotiations are done. It used to be by phone. Once in a while, we would agents usually go to the NFL Combine, which is where the top college athletes go just before the draft. So sometimes you'd meet in person with teams, but a lot of it is phone. And now a lot of it is, I'm going to send you an Excel spreadsheet. Here's what we're willing to offer. I go in and edit it. I send it back or I text it back. And that's how the deals are done.
All right. So I know that the USFL just held its inaugural draft. The XFL is kicking off its season in April. The NFL draft is in late April too. Is this a busy time of year for you?
Yeah, it really is because mostly long snappers are kind of in a tough situation because in Canada, they now only use Canadian long snappers. So if you're a college long snapper, you're looking to get in the NFL, that's your only place to play. So the development of the USFL this year, which is debuting, and hopefully the return of the XFL will give some snappers more opportunity to get game action. But the problem with trying to get a job as an NFL long snapper, I always tell people that you're basically trying to get elected as United States Senator or maybe president, for better or worse, because there's 32 jobs. But in reality, most of the guys who are snapping in the NFL are literally the 32 best in the world. So there's not a lot of job openings. When you get the job, it's great because you can have that job for 10, 12, 15 years if all goes well, assuming no injuries, assuming no mental struggles, you can have that job for a long time. If you're on the outside looking in, it's very hard to break into. So what I tell college athletes is, again, you're trying to get one of the hardest jobs in the world. There's no other way to say it. But if you get it, and maybe every year there's maybe one or two that are open where there's an older snapper, et cetera, et cetera. If you get one of those two, you can be doing this for 10, 12, 15 years, but it's very hard to break into.
So some of the things that I emphasize when talking about client relationships in my litigation practice are timely and effective communication, being available and responsive to, clients and potential clients, and being willing to have hard conversations. Are those the kind of things that carry over into representing individuals over the course of their careers?
They really are. And I think that's one of the reasons I've been able to do this as an agent, essentially by myself. That's my law firm. But when my players call me, they get me, right? I have no staff for the football. There's no apparatus. There's no marketing person. I do everything. So the way I've been able to be successful and do it for as long as I have, I've just done over 100. I just did my 100th NFL contract about a year or two ago. The reason I've been able to do it is because of that timely communication. So a player knows when they're calling me, they're not getting an assistant. They're not getting, somebody who works for me. They're getting me. And they know that after the game, they're going to get a text from me. Hey, I saw this, I saw that. That constant communication is critical, very close to the family members as well. In fact, I have some clients where I'm talking to their wife more than I'm talking to the player, just helping to take care of all those off the field issues. So I kind of view it as I'm like the CEO of the player's business in that sense. So having that strong line of communication, effective communication, timely communication, And yeah, I think having the hard talks is also what separates me from most agents, because a lot of agents fear if I have a hard talk with my client and I tell them no to something, somebody else is going to tell them yes. And luckily with long snappers, there's not a lot of competition for my clients, right? I'm not representing quarterbacks or wide receivers. A lot of agents fear having that talk with a player to say, hey, maybe we need to think about some other things that you're going to be doing when this is over, or maybe investing in your best friend's health club or, record deal is not the best way to use your money. So I think that ability to have those hard conversations and develop that trust and honesty between the client, that's what's critical. And that's what's helped me be able to survive in this business, because there are not a lot of Kevin Goldens. Most of the agents in the NFL, they're large companies, CAA, Athletes First, large organizations with 20, 30 people. It's very hard to do what I do on my own, but that's why I kind of found this kind of niche and kind of do it with this unique brand of football players.
So are there a lot of situations where you become not just the agent for their NFL contract, but more of a role of a business manager overall?
I think that really is true, because you really are involved in so many aspects of their career. And I always tell the players or their parents or their girlfriends or wives, we're not dating, we're getting married. So I view the relationship, when we start that agent relationship, to me, it continues. I'll go back to Rob Davis, my first client. That was in the late 80s. Still one of my best friends, still somebody I talk to regularly, because if I'm doing my job well, I'm involved not just when you're on the field, I'm involved when you're doing something else. Now, Rob is still in the NFL. He's an assistant head coach with the Dallas Cowboys, so he's still in the game. But other clients, it's the same way. A lot of my clients, even after they've retired, there's still a relationship there. There's still a bond. They know they can call me. They know I'm not charging them. The meter isn't running, and I'm just going to give them advice because, again, my goal is, sure, I'm representing you during those 3, 5, 7, 10 years of the NFL. But if I'm doing my job and doing it well, I'm still involved in your career, because we're going to make sure you're as successful off the field with what you're doing the next 10, 20, 30 years.
Yeah, and that's something I tell my insurance and corporate clients too, is if you have a problem in Alabama, call me. It may not be a case that you ever send me or ever goes into litigation, but it's something new and weird because we've got some strange laws and you just don't know what to do. Right. So call me and let's talk about it. And I'm not going to charge you for every, phone call, because that's part of building the relationship and making sure it's a career relationship and not just a one case that I maximize every dime and wring all the blood out of that one case. I want this to last over the course of a career.
I think that's great advice. Not just, I followed that advice, is always looking long-term, not the short-term. And I think it's good advice to agents. I think it's good advice to lawyers generally, because I think as lawyers, you come in and there's the pressure to develop business and generate revenue. To me, I think with some of these relationships, you have to build them, and it's over time. And so you spend a lot of non-billable time. You're going to breakfast, you're answering the phone, you're answering the call on the weekend. I can't write down 0.25 or 0.30. But it's building that relationship of trust so that 5, 10 years down the road, when that person is in a position to help you, well, then you have a more traditional billing type relationship. And I think if I analyze myself, I think I do a good job of always thinking the long play here and not just the short-term gain, but you have to think long-term how these things are going to go.
Yeah. All right. So when I want to reach out to new or to potential clients, I usually do it at industry events, conferences. What does the community around long snapping look like where you do the marketing and where you build the relationships?
Yeah, honestly, a lot of it is through my Twitter account. So I know a lot of the top high school snappers. There's a high school award that I helped select for the best high school long snapper. I also helped create a college long snapper award. So that's one of the big things that we started about 3 years ago, the Patrick Manley Award. It's named after Patrick Manley, who was one of the first snappers who was drafted just for his skill as a snapper. And that's to give a award recognition to the best college long snapper. So we do a live event. I had to skip 2 years ago because of COVID, but it was back live this year in Chicago. We have about 250 people who come for an evening to honor long snappers. But the most important thing and the most rewarding thing to me was we also give back. So the award is on a Saturday. On Friday, we go into the communities, we go into schools and do a book drive, because one of the groups that promotes the award is involved, is a book bank. So we put that community service aspect into it. So that's one of the big events, is that College Long Snapper Award. Also the kind of community, the social media community, the internet community. That's how I connect with a lot of the clients. A lot of them have followed me since they've been in high school and in college, and on their career through the pro journey into the pros. So that's where a lot of it happens. But the Manley Award in particular has been a great way to kind of recognize snappers for their on-field talent, but also to get them involved with community service as well.
So it sounds like there's a lot of crossover between the marketing principles that you apply for your law practice and as you do as an NFL agent.
Yeah, I think that's true. It's funny. I never really thought of that way because, again, I always kind of think of them separately. The firm you see behind me, Pillar Aught, is a firm I created with some partners about 5 years ago. I was at a bigger firm in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, bigger firm. And we all left and wanted to set up our own shop. And at that prior place, my sports practice was really separate. They didn't really get it. They didn't really understand it. They didn't really want to support it. So I'm not used to having that kind of support. But here, having it part of the firm, yeah, it is kind of the same way I try to develop relationships with my employment law clients or my IP clients. Yeah, there's a lot of times where they're just calling for advice. I might not be able to help, but they just want to bounce something off me. So again, I'm not writing down that time. You're building the relationship, you're building the trust. And it's the same principle as a long snapper. I want to be dealing with, like, I've had employment law clients for all my career, 25, 30 years. You want to have that same approach where they know you're their trusted advisor. So even if it's something you don't necessarily do, they know that they can call you, they can get a right referral, they can get honest advice, they can talk to you off the clock. And I think if you ask some of my traditional law clients, they would say that's one of my better attributes, is that they never feel like the clock is running. Of course, they always want to talk football for the first 10 minutes when they call me, but that is, football is non-billable time. So
do you think that having this niche practice of representing long snappers gives you certain advantages in that you obviously have very specialized knowledge of the subject matter and you're embedded in the community?
Yeah, I think so. I think, again, it's always a conversation point for people. Like, and I'll bring it back to my law firm clients. I half joking, they all love to talk football. So anytime something happens in football, they want to talk to me. It kind of helps solidify those law firm relationships. But it is kind of this unique thing when you tell people what it is you do. Somebody always knows a long snapper or has their own unique story. So it is kind of this kind of unique thing that I'm able to do that kind of is, a way to distinguish myself, for lack of a better term.
And the corollary question, I guess, is, are there any disadvantages that you recognize of having a niche practice like that?
Not really. The other thing, I guess the only thing that people have said to me is, well, why don't you go after other positions? Why don't you represent quarterbacks or wide receivers? And, and I've always kind of stayed in my lane with the long snappers. I have kind of branched out a little bit. Fullbacks, I've represented a number of fullbacks, John Kuhn of the Packers being one of the most notable ones. But I still kind of can equate fullbacks to long snappers because they're kind of unsung heroes too. Most teams don't even use a fullback. So if you're a fullback coming out, you don't even have 32 job opportunities. You really have 10 or 11 because teams don't use them. So I have branched out a little bit, but every time I try to branch out a little bit more, I remind myself how much I love the guys who are long snappers. And they don't have the ego. I'm not saying NFL players all have egos, but they don't have the egos and the expectations. And my phone doesn't ring at 2 a.m. I leave it on in case it needs to ring, but it doesn't ring. They're not getting in trouble. There's no issues. So I've often thought, and people have said, oh, now you need to expand and grow and get into other sports. But I always end up right back home at the long snappers just because it's familiar. I don't want to represent a position unless I know it backwards and forwards, to do my ethical duty, to represent them zealously and fiduciary duty. I know this position. I know all the contracts. So I like kind of having this unique space to operate in. And so, yeah, sometimes I've creeped out a little bit, but I always seem to come back home.
I think that, so a couple of weeks ago, I interviewed a friend of mine for the podcast, Trip Watson, who he is a lawyer who represents entrepreneurs. Yep. And that's his practice and that's who he markets to. And I asked him a similar question about, do you wish you had a broader practice or would that benefit you? And he gave a very similar answer to yours. And it was, I know these people and I know what their needs are. and I know that I can meet those needs, and I know what we need to do for both of us to be successful. And it sounds like you feel the same way.
Yeah, and I think we're almost getting to the point where there's specialization everywhere, and that's mentioned in the Freakonomics podcast. But I think specialization is the way to go for a lot of these industries. At the end of the day, do you want to have brain surgery by an orthopedic surgeon? Probably not. You want a specialist. So I think we're in an era of specialization. And again, I feel most comfortable in my niche, knowing the players, knowing how they operate. The teams know that's where I operate. I know the special teams coaches, so I know all the players. So, to me, again, if Aaron Rodgers were to call me and ask me to help, I'd probably take his call. But again, I feel most home here with my unsung heroes and understanding their plight and their pursuit of perfection. And I like being a part of it.
Well, as we get ready to wind down here, are there any war stories that you can share that you like to tell? There's so many. There's really so many of the long snappers. One of the most interesting to me, I have a client that spent about 10 years in the NFL, and his mom attended every single game. Wow.
Attended in college, attended in the pros. That's interesting by itself, right? Because he played in Super Bowls and played at a top level FBS school. She has never seen him snap. She gets so nervous on fourth down when he's about to snap, on punts, on field goals or extra points, that she would stand up and turn around every single stadium. So through high school, through college, through the pros, through the Super Bowl, she's never actually seen him snap because of the nerves that were attached to that one snap. So I have a number of great stories, but to me, that one was always the most interesting. So the player's mom had been to every single game, but never actually watched him snap because of the nerves that were attached to that one play.
Well, that is, that's really interesting.
Right. It's hard to respond to. You don't even know what to say.
Yeah. I mean, like my wife's grandmother is a diehard Auburn fan, but cannot watch the games because she gets so much anxiety, and there's not even that personal level of attachment of it's her own child out there. So I understand. All right. You've mentioned the Twitter feed, but tell people how they can follow you and keep up with the work that you're doing.
Yeah, so longsnap.com is the Twitter feed, and longsnap.com if you want to learn anything about college, NFL long snappers. Website, now it's a blog technically, but it's dedicated to it. It gets updated every couple of days. More than you wanted to know, and everything you want to know about the world of long snapping is right there at your fingertips.
Thanks so much, Kevin. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Thanks, Jeremy. I appreciate it.
If you've enjoyed the show, you can support it by rating it on Apple Podcasts or wherever it is you're listening, and make sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. You can also support the show on Patreon at patreon.com/lawyerpreneur. Thanks for listening.